Welcome to this week's episode of Food Bites. It's a continuation of a great discussion I had last week with researcher Cheryl Forchuk, who's done so much digging into the subject of mental health and also of people who are homeless. She's well known in Canada and around the world for the work she has done. In 2017, she was made a member of the Order of Ontario. She has over 5,000 citations to her name. She's pretty remarkable, and she's a London treasure who often goes unknown in our midst. This one I continued on because we were discussing mortality, what it was like for people who were homeless. Many of them were lost or forgotten, though many who died alone. And Cheryl's done a fair bit of work on that, working with things like coroner's reports and other things. And it's such a fantastic opportunity for those of us in London who really support the Health and Homeless Initiative to consider what some of the implications are if we don't get our act together as a community and as a country. Really, the people who are struggling in homelessness have so many challenges that they're having to face. I think we all know that. But it's really understanding what the dire consequences could be if they don't get assistance over a lengthy period of time. Cheryl has worked across the country on this. She's worked in remote regions. She's worked in major cities. She's worked with Indigenous populations, with immigrant populations, and above all, for our purpose, homeless populations. This is important. I mean, I remember, was it a year and a half ago, when it was reported in the media that over 100 people had died who were homeless in London. I think a lot of us it was sad. We knew that it was an ongoing problem, but we didn't know that that could be the end of it for some of these folks. The pandemic made it doubly hard to keep in touch with these folks and try to help them, despite the fact that so many of London's social agencies were doing their absolutely dead-level best to reach out to those people and help them. It was a really difficult time. But we might have rounded a corner. I mean, with the Health and Homeless Initiative, with all the major players that are part of it, the agencies that are assisting in the administration of care and oversight, and also the hospitals and other medical professionals who are watching out over this, making sure that there are standards to it and that these people are taken care of. Maybe not only can we round the corner on the problem of homelessness, maybe we can make it so that somebody who is alone and is deeply suffering from physical, mental, or emotional stress, rather than succumbing some kind of fate that none of us want to consider, perhaps we can intervene earlier, perhaps we can find ways to help. It's just so important, and we as a community can't just go ahead and say, hey, we got a new initiative, we're helping the homeless. The food bank, for instance, is feeding a whole bunch of different meals to the different agencies and other homeless encampments that are around the city. But it's not enough. What if we did all of that only to discover that the ones who were the most vulnerable of the homeless population never did enter the system, never did get seen, and died alone somewhere? I can't imagine that in my community, and I won't. We have to organize. We have to find ways of getting it together. But to do that, we need data, really good data. And that's what Cheryl and her colleagues have done for us. We have that information now, and we begin moving ahead. So this represents the second part of that interview. I just let Cheryl run on. She was having to go to a dentist shortly afterwards, but I appreciated her taking that extra time to educate me and many of us on what are the consequences if we don't act. But she also talks about some of the hope that she is having because we are acting. I think it's a very, very important episode, and I hope we all learn lots from it.
So when COVID hit, many of us knew that the homeless sector was going to be disproportionately impacted, but they were not originally prioritized for vaccines. So we were able to use the algorithm. And again, Lucy Richard was first author on that one, Richard Booth second, and Salima on that, as well as others of us. We also, at that point, were able to pull in community health data as well, which was tremendously important. And we were able to show the incredible additional risk that people experiencing homelessness were. Like, they were 3 times more likely to get a COVID test, almost 4 times more likely to test positive. but they were over 20 times more likely than the general population of Ontario to be hospitalized. 20 times. ICU over 10 times, and almost 6 times more likely than the general population to be dead within 21 days of the positive test. So clearly, like we're practically in the ballpark of 90-year-olds in long-term care at this point. So fortunately, and it was interesting at that time, ICES was giving a priority to anything COVID related. So we were able to very rapidly do this assessment, and then the journals were rapidly publishing. So I think from start to end, it was like a month, which like any researchers listening should be sitting down, because you never do a whole paper and get it written and published that fast. Yeah. But it was critical to get this done, to make sure that this group was recognized as being vulnerable and to get them assistance. Yeah. So just an example of having that data, how important it was, because if you're talking about a population 20 times more likely to end up in hospital, how do you deal with that if you're not prioritizing them, right? Yeah. So anyway, one of the recent ones I'm really excited about using this data, when we went across the country, I mean, we've heard about the opioid crisis, right? We've all heard about this. We know that people talk about it as being kind of like a second pandemic that was happening simultaneously. It's certainly a second healthcare crisis. And when I would talk to people experiencing homelessness over and over again, we'd often hear about their friend that died last week. Sometimes we'd have people that in different communities that had some part-time employment that would actually take time off work to come meet with us and talk about the issues facing people with homelessness in honor of their friend that died last week. Now, their friend could have died for many reasons. It could be suicide. It could be freezing to death. But it could be COVID, right? But the opioid crisis was certainly playing a major role. So it's only 2 weeks tomorrow that this paper came out. And I think you'll have to admit, and the listeners, like when we hear about the opioid crisis and opioid deaths, we know it's like it's blind to housing status, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so when we talk about the problem of the opioid crisis and how to solve it, where have we heard about housing? We know housing is a social determinant of health. We have, just as income is, but we often then don't actually pay attention to it. Yeah. So we will, and one of the people that joined on this paper was Tara Gomes, who has worked a lot with coroner's data. So we were able to pull the coroner data in and look at that. So the one way of looking at that was just a straight thing. How many times on that coroner data did it simply indicate the person was homeless in Ontario?
No fixed address. Yep. Right.
Yeah. And this is looking at deaths from 2017 to 2021. So it included the period prior to the pandemic as well as the pandemic. So just looking at that alone, 1 in 6 people that died in Ontario in that time period were homeless. So
that's amazing. But we wouldn't know.
But we wouldn't know.
It's just something I want to talk with you about at a later point, because I do think it was the knowledge of it when it finally came out in the press that actually kind of blew the doors off, and everybody suddenly started wanting to do something about homelessness, but it means that they didn't know about it before.
Exactly. So that was just the coroner data, like what was written, 1 in 6. Then we looked at our algorithm where we could actually look at the people from that perspective. From the algorithm, do we actually know that they had been homeless within the year, and so that they had this housing security? When we did that, 1 in 3 deaths in Ontario from opiate overdoses. So how and yet we are blind to that. We talk about this opiate crisis all the time. The other really interesting thing, and we've had a lot with opiate, a lot of emphasis on like Narcan, resuscitation efforts. And it's interesting. And in some of our current studies, we're even starting to ask, because I'm interested, I've just been hearing so much about the resuscitation efforts, because what I was hearing on the street, talking to people and in the encampments, when they talk about it, that they had things available to help resuscitate people. But if you're on the street, a lot of this is supposed to be kept roughly at room temperature. I can remember a couple people telling me they went to use it and it was frozen.
Yeah.
Right? And the same thing in terms of extreme heat. So one of the things that was also looked at was the resuscitation efforts. And people, if you just look at the general population of Ontario, so like if someone's dead, and someone was with them in attempted resuscitation, the resuscitation failed, obviously, because they're dead. And in the population of Ontario as a whole, it's about 18% is what we found, that somebody was with them, did try to help, but it was unsuccessful. And sometimes people attempt to resuscitate someone that's already dead, right? But they're going to give it a last-ditch report. So you would expect that sometimes when you attempt to resuscitate someone, it's just not possible. But with the homeless population, it was 48%.
Yeah.
So they actually had someone with them who was actually trying to help, but it didn't work.
I did want to interrupt you to say that I was part of outreach teams during the pandemic that was going, especially down by the river, helping homeless folks. And my daughter was often with me. And at one point we came to a person, and that individual was dead. And because of my firefighter training, nobody knew quite what to do. So, but eventually nothing could be done until the coroner came.
Right. But you still attempted.
Sorry?
Yeah. So you're right. Like, you still attempt it, even if you think they're dead, you still attempt.
That's right. And then the coroner came, pronounced the person dead, and that was that. But I remember driving back from there, talking with my daughter, saying, if this happened in a senior's home, if it happened in a school or a hospital or a business, and all of a sudden this thing was happening, we all as society would be glued in to find out what the heck happened there, right? But this was happening in a homeless population, and it wasn't just one incident. What we found out is over those 2 years, 100 people had perished. 100 homeless folks had perished because of it. And I think those numbers were eventually what got Londoners to realize the seriousness of it. But really, so much of the problem of dealing with the things that you're talking about is that you have to go to coroner's reports to try to get some of that information. Like, they're just not part of this.
And pull it in to the health data so that we can run our algorithm.
I know. Like that's so hard. Does that, have you, though, in doing this, started to uncover things that make you realize, you and Richard and the others that you're working with, that make you realize, hey, let's even go deeper. There's real truth in here, real social good, not just research stuff and data, but real good stuff. Yeah,
absolutely. And again, like, because, like, as I said, like, we've got these other great people that work with the data, and it's useful to also, because I'm talking to people, like, we talked to 400 people experiencing homelessness across the country, and a lot of the questions we end up taking is because it's raised by people with lived experience. And why people participate in that interview, they've told us over and over again, it is to make these issues visible. Because they feel they have no voice, that they're not heard, that they're often suffering in silence, and so I think part of my role is to bear witness to what is happening, but then bearing witness is not enough. It's an important step, and people. I can remember several communities, people who we had already got our sample and said, "Thank you so much for coming, even though we weren't able to participate. We're just so happy you were here." But bearing witness is also part of that, is to make these issues visible, not just to observe it, but to let people know about it. And as you say, to go deeper. So if people are saying this is happening, can we go back to this data and we have their experience, that we have what they've told us, and also give evidence that they're speaking truth. That this is happening on a broader level, and many times these can be solvable problems if we can identify the problems for starts. If we know what this baseline information is, we can start then looking at solutions.
Yeah, I mean, from my view, I really think the bearing witness is so important, and it's not about the outcomes. You have to bear witness regardless, because the outcomes are up to policy, governments, communities.
Maybe beyond my control.
But I do think that the idea of advocacy, the idea of doing something about it, is often really hard. For instance, if as I said, if this was happening at a Fortune 500 company, or if it was happening at a hospital, there would be a universal outcry for something to be done about it. So I think we get that. The problem, though, is when we finally get the data around the homeless piece, the very things that you've been talking to, which are so awesome. We don't hear these things. They're really awesome. But by the time public policy responds to that bit of data, which is very current right now, but they're still responding to data from 5 years ago. That's often what happens, and I know that because I've been in Ottawa. And those
Yeah, you've been there.
But do you find it frustrating that you present new data, but the policy mechanisms of government are open to points of view, partisanship, maybe an election that's coming up, all of those kind of things? I realize the bureaucracy and deputy ministers and others, they're always on these things and they're looking at them. But the political masters often have other things that they're preoccupied with. And it must be really hard when you come out with current data, as current as yours is right now, even the coroner stuff or the provincial stuff. And yet you know very well that when you take it to Ottawa, it could be years before there's a response. Do you feel that that's true? And if you do, how do you feel you can change that?
I you know what? I'm an optimist. I couldn't work in this area without having some optimism. I think you are too. So two things. I mean, one of the things I was most thrilled that when we did showing the risk, 3 days after that paper came out, and that paper did go to the provincial vaccine committee. They prioritized the homeless population, and within the week, pretty much the rest of the country. So sometimes you can do that, but part of what in going across the country, I was able to identify really bad policies just about everywhere I went. And one of the things I said to the people that I was talking to is I would do my best to shine a light on those bad policies. So when we went back the second time for our community forums, and also the media relations committee at Lawson was awesome with it, because we set up press conference and every place we went, and we went to 28. We had 28 communities involved. And so we had media releases go out. We had a lot of really good press coverage. And I did, if there was, there's prizes for the worst policy, like one of the worst had to be Alberta, for example, that if you lost your housing and you were on Alberta Works or Alberta Disability, you didn't just lose the housing portion of your income, you lost the entire thing. So across the country, if you're on basic income support, you make it's roughly around $600 a month, and most of the housing allowances is around $320. You're not going to get rich on that $280, but you might still be able to buy an occasional sandwich. What do you do with zero income? And this is not just basic income, it's also the people on disability. So I talked to people who've been in group homes with disabilities for a decade, got rent evicted, now zero income. How do you get out of that? So I raised that when in Alberta, for example. When I was in Saskatchewan, they had another really dumb one around not being able to have direct payment if you were on provincial income support. So you couldn't pay the landlord directly or pay for your utilities, et cetera. like as a monthly automatic thing. So I've tried to identify some of these issues as we went, and make sure it was covered in the press, give ammunition to opposition parties to have debates. Now, I don't know if that will result in a change, but at least it makes it visible. And I feel that's what I can do. And you know, it's in terms of getting the press coverage, it's not just that it's not about getting your name there. It's about making sure that these issues that were really impacting people's lives, that people realize that there's bad policies that are really contributing to the problem.
Yeah. And then, I'm a community guy. That's who I am. I got into politics in Ottawa for a time. Didn't like it because it seemed to me to be so slow in response. And then you come back down to the community, something like the Health and Homeless Initiative happens, and you think, oh gosh, this is awesome. Somebody donates $25 million. There's all these other groups coming in, developers, businesses, citizens, agencies, hospitals, research. It's just so great. But then you have to make a decision. Where do those hubs go? And suddenly that's where democracy's, where the rubber meets the road. You have a public hearing in an area of town that you're hoping to put a hub in, and people don't want it at all. A great many of them speak out against it. But what I've learned in speaking with people about it is because they don't understand it.
Right.
They just think it's going to look like downtown if that's what you do, and these people are here. That's why this kind of thing that we're doing here, Cheryl, is so important, because people need better understanding than just that we have to help the homeless. We have to reason why that is, also why it's more profitable to actually do that as opposed to not deal with it. All of those things. But how do you feel after doing all that work, and you come back from Ottawa and you hope somebody listened or whatever it was, and then you read in the paper that at this particular hub thing in a certain community, there's so many people that are against it. Do you ever feel sometimes that could very much undermine some of the things that you're trying to do?
It constantly undermines the NIMBYism, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm an optimist, when I went across the country, I saw seeds of hope. Is the first time and I think it's even this 25 million is an example of this. I found much bigger pockets of yes in my backyard. Now, it has not overtaken the not in my backyard, and I don't expect the not in my backyard is going to evaporate overnight. Honestly, it's been so much part of it. I expect it. So I find encouragement from the yes in my backyard and say, let's capitalize and build on that. I've seen people more recognize people experiencing homelessness as neighbors, as people. I mean, of the 400 people we interviewed, about 16% had their first episode of homelessness during the pandemic. And I think that people often really began to see that they were neighbors. I think it's going to take a long time to overtake that more negative view, but we have to fan the fires on these people who are saying, yes, these are my neighbors. Yes, these are people. I can't remember if I mentioned last time, the first time this happened when we went to the communities, I couldn't believe my ears. I kept saying, explain this again. I think I've heard wrong. And they had this Facebook page, and we went and joined their weekly meetings. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And it was a community that noticed people were sleeping in their cars overnight.
Yes, you talked about this. It's fascinating. I remember. Remind us.
Yeah. And so the usual go-to is call the police and say, get them out of here. Yeah. And this community was instead saying, let's see what we can do. And they were leaving notes on the windshields, and they had it organized to go to different places for a shower, et cetera, to have people there, other neighbors to make safe. But we found that in 3 communities. And none of the communities knew about each other. But I was shocked, because that is just people were recognizing people as people, neighbors and neighbors, recognize how vulnerable we all can be. I think during the pandemic, many people lost their jobs. Many people were vulnerable, et cetera. So I think we have to accept that there will be some NIMBYism, do what we can in terms of education, but really fan the fires on these grassroots movements. Yeah. We do have them in London, where we have them in many places where people are saying this is not right, and I care.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to me what you're saying is really hopeful. And I know from people that I talk with about it, the problem with many of us is that we are Canadians. So we go to a public meeting and suddenly somebody stands up, and I know we call it NIMBYism, but oftentimes it's because they don't understand the data. They don't have the data. They don't understand what that population will be, how that will be and how they'll be treated. But at the same time, I think that they're afraid to speak up at those public meetings. And then there's the responsibility of the media in that. And I really credit the media in London with blowing the doors off, as I said earlier. This is awesome. But they might go to a public meeting and they'll cover the story of the 2 or 3 people that are really don't want it in their neighborhood, and they give the news. And if
we want equal views.
That's right. So we really need the media to do it as well. But it's a unfortunate thing that something like this, that is so important. Even if I was at a meeting like that, and I've been to a couple, even if I was at them, I'd be hesitant to speak up in case I added to the toxicity of the meeting itself. So somehow we have to get through that fog of ignorance that we all have. And find a way, for the sake of our vulnerable citizens, to do better. I don't know. It worries me, and yet at the same time, when I hear you say, you go across the country and you hear this kind of stuff, it really does ring with what I have experienced with people. Yeah. That overall they want to see it fixed and they want something done about it, but unfortunately, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Right?
Yeah, so we have to squeak a bit more on the other side.
Yeah. But I do think we have to squeak knowledgeably. I think that's so important. Like you're saying stuff here, and that I think that most of us who are involved in the homeless thing are really thinking about London, the hubs and those kind of things. You're helping us to understand just how vast this is. Right, and the numbers and other things, but also that having those numbers, we can now take those things to Ottawa, to Queen's Park, whatever, City Hall, and deal with these numbers now so that we have something that's accurate. That is hopeful, just having the information.
Yeah, and if we look at these numbers, and we talked about this in the paper, if 1 in 3 people that had an opiate death, related death, whether we call it poisoning or overdose, was homeless, like at what point and we talk about housing as a social determinant of health, but we need to be thinking about housing as a health intervention. And that's one of the things that the hubs are looking at it. And this really gives support that we really needed to take it to the next level and say housing is a health intervention. We can't just put things in their separate silos. They are all related.
Yeah. Cheryl, you're so kind to come to us. I know you have to go to a dentist from here, you poor girl. I appreciate the extra time you've given, but I hope you understand when I say we need to keep doing this, Cheryl, because I think average people like myself who don't have your value of exposure to these things, I think we need to learn and we need to grow. So I'll be back at you, and maybe Richard as well, and some of the others. Yeah, we need to do more of these things. I know, but we need to do more of these things because I think as a community, we finally pulled up our bootstraps and we've decided to do something. There's some naysayers, there's others that are sitting back and observing, but we're not going to be successful unless we have the information that you're bringing out to us. It's really important. So I hope you'll have another one of these sessions where we can bring more on board if you wish to. But we really need it, Cheryl. And I can see why you have over 5,000 citations and why you're the Order of Ontario. I mean, it's these are things that you would think, oh, it's obscure, right? You're in research. It's actually the very thing that's on the front page of the paper every day, how we're trying to deal with homelessness, and that's the stuff you're researching. Mental health, addictions, those things are so important. You mean a lot to us as a community. You're a real treasure. I really appreciate you doing it. Well, thank you. And I'll get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Good luck at the dentist. See you.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.